Yeah, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. My name's Eric Basta, Business Development Manager for NHMEP, New Hampshire Manufacturing Extension Partnership. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, CMMC 2.0 and what it means for DoD manufacturers. So let's go to the slide. So on this slide, you can see that we, NHMEP, offers services in 3 key areas. For product development, we work closely with the UNH College of Engineering for designing, developing, and manufacturing new products. We improve manufacturing processes by offering training on Lean, Six Sigma, ISO, geometric dimensioning and tolerancing, and plant layout, just to name a few. And we also help manufacturers reposition their business model to find new clients with our business growth training in the areas of marketing and sales. The New Hampshire Manufacturing Extension Partnership is one of a nationwide system of MEP centers linked through the U.S. Department of Commerce and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. There's at least one MEP center located in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, and we're able to leverage a vast array of public and private resources and services that are available to every manufacturing enterprise in the state. Our mission is simple. We help manufacturers in New Hampshire improve their productivity, compete globally, and keep jobs in the state. We, NHMEP, has worked with over 700 New Hampshire manufacturers and touched over 11,000 employees who've gone through our manufacturing training programs. Slide. So our services consist of 3 major areas. The first is operational excellence. This is where we offer the training I mentioned earlier on Lean, Six Sigma, plant layout, blueprint reading, geometric dimensioning and tolerancing, and lean, green, and energy services. The second area is workforce development. Here we're part of the Sector Partnership Initiative in New Hampshire, where we work with middle schools, high schools, community colleges, and manufacturers to build the future workforce in the state. And every year we put on Manufacturing Month, and during Manufacturing Month, we coordinate school visits to manufacturers in the hope that some students will make manufacturing a career. Last year, we had 1,605 students visit to 45 New Hampshire manufacturers. And keeping with workforce development, we provide leadership training, team building and problem solving, technical skills training, and training within industry. The third area is innovative growth strategies. We offer the Sales Training Collaborative, a custom sales training program, web and SEO improvement services, and the Marketing Strategies Collaborative. We also offer quality management system training, which includes the various ISO standards. We have food safety training, technology-driven marketplace intelligence, or TDMI, as well as the topic of today's presentation, CMMC 2.0. And that's for manufacturing contractors and subcontractors who perform work for the U.S. Department of Defense. Okay, whoops, let me just, sorry, lost my place. As for the New Hampshire MEP's economic impact, after our clients have gone through one of our training programs, NIST MEP, where we receive partial funding, requires us to have them fill out an impact survey. As you can see from the slide, it shows you the compiled economic impact we've received from our clients during the last 3 years. And next slide. We've partnered with Mainstay Technologies since 2018 and have served over 38 clients together. We continue to move forward with helping New Hampshire manufacturers. Now I'd like to introduce you to Paige Yater, Director of Information Security Program Management for Mainstay Technologies, our partner. And so now I'll turn things over to Paige.
Thanks, Eric. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I was looking at the attendee list and I see some familiar names. So if you've been with us before, welcome back. We're happy to have you back. If you are new to this presentation, we've done these several times throughout the years, over the last couple of years, actually. And so I'm excited to have you join us and look forward to walking through this with you. As the slide says, I am the Director of Information Security Program Management. I am also a CMMC AB, which is the accreditation body, registered practitioner, which means that I've been through some training and have sort of insider information on how we prepare organizations to approach CMMC and get prepared for CMMC. Mainstay is an IT and information security organization. We work with all different types of organizations across New Hampshire and Northern New England. And we have 2 offices, one in Belmont and one in Manchester. The presentation today, we're going to talk about 4 areas. And if you've been through one of these presentations before, we're changing things up a little bit. There's a lot of new information. There's actually a lot that's been happening with CMMC in 2021 into 2022. So there's some updates, some changes, some shifts that we want to make sure that we call out. So we're going to start by talking about the model itself. What is the model? What does it look like? How did we get here? That type of thing. The next thing we're going to talk about is the rules. So the rules are specific to the DFARS clauses. We're going to talk a little bit about how this is enforced in contracts, what you should be looking for in your contracts to determine what kind of requirements you have here. And then we'll dig into the assessment. So this is where we'll start talking about the assessment process. We'll talk about the levels. We'll talk about what each of the levels requires. We'll get into some technical goo there. And then we'll talk about some things to consider. So what do you do from here? So we'll give you a lot of information and then tell you sort of where you go from here. If you have questions, shoot them in the Q&A section throughout the presentation. Just send them out as they come in. I'll try to keep an eye on the Q&A section. Eric will help me keep an eye on those questions and answers, but definitely shoot me over questions throughout as they come up. All right, so let's talk about the model. So the first thing that we want to talk about, we want to level set on some terms. So there are 2 key terms that we need to understand when it comes to CMMC. CMMC is protecting 2 different types of information. The first is FCI, which is federal contract information, and the second is CUI, which is controlled unclassified information. So these 2 types of information are separated out because they're different levels of protection needed. They're different levels of sensitivity, if you will. So federal contract information is really just around contract data. It's not necessarily rising to the level of classified. It's something that might be available, but probably we don't want to make publicly available. Controlled and classified information is defined through an executive order that President Obama implemented in 2016. I think 2016 was when that order was signed. And basically it just defines specific types of information. I'll give you some guidance. The National Archives has defined CUI, and there's a lot of information out there around what actually constitutes CUI. It's sort of there's a lot of detailed information, but it's still a little bit vague. So you're going to have to do some work on your end to figure out what actually falls into CUI and what doesn't. All right, let's see. First question. Clearly CMMC is important and critical. If a new company is in the DoD R&D phase, do they have to comply? It's clear that once manufacturing or subcontracting is happening, then CMMC must be applied, but R&D. Yes, it's a great question, Joe. So I think the requirements for CMMC are specific to an actual contract, and any RFI, any RFP will indicate what information they expect to flow down as part of that contract. But until the contract is in place, those DFARS clauses don't apply. I would definitely confirm that with your contracting officer just to ensure. And as we go into the rules in just a few minutes, we'll talk about those specific rules and things that you should be looking for. But my understanding is at this point that until you have a signed contract with one of these rules in it, you may or may not need to comply. At this point, if you don't have a contract that says you need to comply with this, then there's no sort of default that you have to comply. You should anticipate compliance, but at this point, I don't think unless you have a contract in place that you have to comply with CMMC. It's a great question. Plan of action and milestones. So plan of action and milestones is a documented plan detailing gaps with 801.71 and CMMC compliance. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but this is an important piece because this allows you as an organization to say, what do we have? What do we not have? And what is our plan to implement what we don't have? So plan of action and milestones is going to be an important document for you to have on a go forward basis. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Organization seeking certification. This is going to be you. You are an organization seeking certification or an OSC. You are going to be seeking certification. However that certification happens, we'll talk about that as well, but you are an organization that's going to be seeking certification. A certified assessor, certified third-party assessing organization, a C3 PAO, which I'm sure there's some sort of Star Wars joke in there, right? C3PAO, certified by the CMMC AB. These are organizations that can actually give you certification. There's a difference between a C3PAO and an RPO, which is a registered practitioner organization. A registered practitioner organization, which is Mainstay, and a registered practitioner, which is me, we're allowed to coach you, we're allowed to support you, we're allowed to consult with you, we're allowed to give you guidance on how to prepare for an assessment, but we can't actually perform an assessment. So it's really important for you to know the distinctions. If you're working with a registered practitioner, they can help you get prepared for an assessment. But when you are actually ready for an assessment, you're going to need to find a certified third-party assessing organization. I will show you where all this information lives, but essentially at this point, the CMMC AB website is going to be a really important location for you to be familiar with. There's some links later on in the presentation, which we'll share with you. They have a whole marketplace of C3PAOs and RPOs. Okay, so those are the terms that we need to level set on. Now let's talk about the timeline. So this has been a process. So I started this timeline in 2017, and I did that for a very specific reason, because 2017 is when all members with the DFAR 7012 clause in their contract needed to comply with NIST 800-171. So NIST 800-171 is it's a special publication from NIST that has 110 requirements. And according to the government, the DoD, all organizations that had this clause needed to be compliant with these 110 requirements as of December 31st, 2017. So that's where this whole thing very first started. In Q1 2020, CMMC 1.0 was released, and the CMMC accreditation body was created. Now, between 2017 and 2020, there were a lot of different things that happened. One of the things that the DoD recognized was that the way that they had rolled out 800-171, which allowed for self-attestation, wasn't getting them the results that they needed. They weren't seeing the progress in the defense industrial base. And so there were some challenges in terms of meeting compliance, in terms of organizations in the DIB actually getting the security layers in place that they needed to get in place. So the DoD worked to create a new model, a new approach. So in Q1 2020, CMMC 1.0 was released. In Q4 of 2020, the initial set of assessment organizations, C3PAOs, was trained. So we started the process of creating organizations that could certify. We started the training process, and we added some new DFAR clauses. So we'll talk about those in the next couple of slides as well. In Q1 2021, President Biden ordered a full review of the CMMC program. So a lot happened between Q1 2020 and Q1 2021. There was a lot of work done on CMMC. There was a lot of documentation. If you attended any of our previous sessions, you know that there was a lot of work. There was a lot of structure put around it. There were a lot of guidelines. It's very, very different than the original set of requirements for 800-171. Self-attestation was out. There was a ton of documentation. There were a ton of requirements. You needed to demonstrate a lot compliance. You needed to demonstrate maturity. There were a lot of things that happened, as they were rolling out CMMC 1.0. So in Q1 2021, President Biden ordered a full review, and everything sort of stopped while that review was going on. There wasn't a whole lot happening. In Q2 2021, the first official C3PAO was certified. So there was still some training going on and some prep work for this, but other than that, there wasn't really much that happened until Q4 of 2021. CMMC 2.0 was released. After the review that President Biden ordered was complete, the DoD released CMMC 2.0, which took some of the pieces of CMMC 1.0 and abandoned some others. Abandoned seems like a good word. Abandoned some of the others. So in CMMC 1.0, they had added some additional requirements to the NIST 800-171. They removed those as part of CMMC 2.0. They also created some changes in terms of self-attestation. So I'll show you a visual of the model in just a second, but CMMC 1.0 required or didn't allow for self-attestation at all. It also didn't allow for plans of action and milestones. CMMC 2.0 allows for both of those things. So we sort of pulled back on some of the things, and there's still some structure around it, which is good. There's still assessment requirements, but it's just a little bit different than it used to be. So current state is what we're talking about. So this timeline gets you kind of up to speed on everything that's happened. As you probably are realizing, it's been a little bit of a tumultuous couple of years, but you know, government's keeping it interesting for us. So we're going to talk today about CMMC 2.0. So now that you know sort of how we got here, this is where we're going to focus our efforts and our energy. In Q1 2020, the ownership for CMMC actually transitioned within the DoD. Originally, it was owned by the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and it has actually been moved to the DoD CIO, Chief Information Officer. There's some additional clarification that the DoD CIO has announced now that he has taken over, specifically limited use of self-attestation in level 2. So let me show you what that actually means. So this is the model as it stands today. Level 1 is the foundational level. It includes 17 practices and allows for annual self-assessment, so self-attestation. Level 2 is the advanced level. They have 110 practices that align with that NIST 800-171. And the third-party assessments are required here with the option for select programs to self-assess. Now, what we're hearing from the DoD CIO is that the use of self-assessments in level 2 is actually going to be pretty minimal. The expectation is that the DoD won't leverage this option very often. So anyone who needs to align with level 2 should work under the assumption that they need to be certified by a C3PAO. Again, we have 110 practices here. The C3PAO process is part of this presentation. We'll go over what that looks like and give you some more information there. And then level 3 is going to be based on NIST Special Publication 800-172, which is not actually yet finalized. It's more than 110 practices, but less than 170, we think, we're not sure. And anyone at level 3, based on the sensitivity of the data in the program that you're working on, will have actually government-led assessments. So the DoD will be doing assessments. The C3PAs won't be able to do assessments at level 3. It'll just be the DoD that can do those assessments. So that's where we are. Today, in this presentation, level 3, like I said, is not finalized. So we are going to focus on level 1 and level 2. If you are an organization that holds CUI, if you are an organization that creates CUI, you need to align with level 2. You need to expect that you will have to align with all 110 of these requirements. And in order to err on the side of caution, we also encourage you to act as though you are needing that third-party assessment. So we're gonna go into the next sections with that in mind, and that is as our frame of reference. Okay, so let's talk about the rules. Let's talk about how do you actually know what's what? What do these rules mean? What should we be looking for? All right, so the current rule. So this is the current requirement rule. This is DFARS 252-204-7012. We have had this rule in place for quite some time. This is the rule that I was referring to, that as of December 31st, 2017, organizations needed to comply with NIST 800-171. So these are the 110 original requirements. The way that DFARS 7012 is written is that contractors must self-attest to their compliance. There is no option for the DoD to verify a contractor's compliance. There is basically just a statement that says that any organization who has this and is getting CUI agrees that they are going to comply or are in compliance with NIST 800-171. The way that this works is that if you have signed a contract, with this clause in it, the expectation is that you are already aligned with all 110 requirements of NIST 800-171. As I mentioned before, there is the option to have a plan of action and milestones. So a lot of organizations that aren't fully compliant already have a plan of action and milestones, but that's going to be an important piece to help bridge that gap and help evaluate where you are and where you need to go next. So we'll talk about that. So this is the current rule. It's in place. You probably have this rule in some of your contracts, if not all of your contracts. So make sure that you're keeping an eye out for this. All right, there's also an interim rule. So this was approved in November, or took effect in November of 2020. This is a set of 2 supplemental rules that work in conjunction with DFARS 7012. So we have 252-204-7019 and 252-204-7020. So basically, 7019 basically requires that any organization that has the 7012 clause must also then submit a self-assessment score into the SPURS database. So if you haven't heard of the SPURS database, you should probably dig into that a little bit. You need to make sure that you have access to it so that you can enter a SPURS score. Your contracting officers are likely to start asking you for that if they haven't already. The self-assessment process is available through DCMA. There's a link to a document later in the presentation that will get you the full details of how that works. But essentially, you have to go in and do a self-assessment. You have to evaluate yourself against NIST 800-171. Like I said, there's 110 requirements. The way the scoring works for this is that the high score, if you are compliant with everything, your high score is 110. If you are not compliant with anything, the low score is -205. So I don't know why they went negative. Feels a little rude, but that's the government's decision. But yeah, so the negative score is 205, the high score is 110. So if you haven't already done this, you will likely have to do this very soon. So 7019 is in conjunction with 7012 and requires that you add your SPURS score. 7020 basically gives the government the opportunity to complete an assessment against those 800-171 controls. So you may remember a little bit ago, I said 7012 rule as it stands doesn't allow for government assessment. So this actually gives the government a documented ownership to be able to say, we believe that we need to assess your organization, and we can come in and do an assessment. There's a variety of different levels of assessment that they could do. There's 3 different levels, I think. So there's definitely some information that they can provide to you if they determine that they want to come in and do an assessment. This rule also allows for enforcement of flow downs to subcontractors, which means that if the DoD thinks that you are not flowing down the requirements to your subcontractors, if you are sharing CUI, you are not enforcing that with your subcontractors, they do have the ability to hold you accountable for not flowing down those requirements. So these two, 7019 and 7020, just give 7012 a little bit more teeth, if you will. It gives the DoD a little bit more control, a little bit more oversight, and a little bit more option when it comes to holding contractors accountable. Okay, so the next rule is 7021, so 252-204-7021. So this was actually established, the rule itself was established, or the rule number anyway, was established as part of the interim rule. This is up in the air at this point because of the changes to CMMC 2.0. So the rulemaking here is still in progress. This rulemaking will take somewhere between 9 and 24 months, according to the DoD. We're unclear as to how long that's actually going to take. But this basically allows for the enforcement of CMMC and will require whatever level, 1, 2, or 3. This will be the rule that will define for you what level you need to comply with as part of whatever contract you're signing. So it's possible that you will have contracts that require you to be at level 1, and you'll have different contracts that require you to be at level 2. So just keep an eye out for this. More to come on this as the rulemaking is finalized. let's see what else. So a couple things that I do want to point out. So if you are selling the DoD COTS products, you are exempt from this because it's not anything custom. It's commercial, it's off the shelf. So you will be exempt from any contract that requires or that you are selling the COTS products to the DoD. So that's important to note if that's an exception that applies to you. But again, if you have one client that you're selling COTS products to and you have another client that you're doing custom work for, you could have a mixed match. So the recommendation here is to sort of default to the highest level that you could potentially have and make sure that you're prepared at that level in the event that you end up at level 2 and need to have that third-party assessment. Okay, so we've talked about how we got here. A lot of very interesting and fun things happening, right? A lot of ups and downs. We talked about the rules, so you know what to look out for in your contracts. The next piece we're going to jump into is assessments. I'm going to pause for just a second, see if there's any questions before we move into the actual assessment process, if there's any questions on the history, how we got here, the rules, etc. Okay, here we go. All right, so the assessment. All right. Okay, so level 1. Basic cyber hygiene here. We have 6 domains and 17 practices. So level 1 is, remember, this is your basic, this is your bottom level. Level 1 is specific to protecting federal contract information, not CUI. So just be really clear. Remember, going back to our terms, federal contract information requires level 1 protections. In level 1, we have 6 different categories or 6 different domains. You might also see these as families, product or compliance families, control families. There's a couple different words for them, but basically it's grouping of the types of requirements that we need to align with. So we have access control, which is about giving access to your data, your systems, and your physical location. We have identification and authentication, which is how do we ensure that the people accessing your systems are the people that we think they are. We have media protection, which is about protecting the devices that you're using, things like removable media. We have physical protection, which is how to protect your physical facility. We have systems and communication protection. So this is about how are we protecting the actual communications with things like encryption and over wireless, right? We're a very interconnected society. Data flows all over the place these days. So we want to make sure that we know where that data is flowing, how it's flowing, and how we're protecting it. And then system and information integrity is about really understanding how secure are our systems, how well protected are they, how are we confident that they haven't been compromised, how do we make sure that we're monitoring those systems in a way that makes sense. Level 1, 17 practices. Okay, for each of these levels, we have 3 separate areas that we think about when we're talking about how to align with these practices. Now, I haven't listed the 17 practices here, the 17 requirements. I have listed the things that you need to have in place to align with those 17 requirements. These are things that are more likely to show up on your plan of action and milestones. So your plan of action and milestones will say things like implement a patch management process, right? That will get you compliance with a couple of different things and will play into the bigger picture. So what we've listed here are the things that you need to have in place at your organization. We've broken it into 3 separate sections: technical, physical, and administrative. Technical, obviously, right? We want to make sure that we're technically addressing our network, our access, et cetera. We do also have physical and administrative. So this is where I get on my very small, I promise, very small little soapbox and talk about the difference between IT security and information security. So IT is a critical part of information security. They are not the only part of information security. As an organization, or compliance for that matter, right? Compliance with anything. As an organization, it's really, really critical that all of your organizations understand that this is a whole organization investment. This isn't just, we hand this to IT and they'll handle it. right? This is a broader picture. This is a bigger scope for the organization. There are processes that you have to align with that are outside the scope of what IT typically handles. Now, IT is going to be critical to making sure that we can hit compliance, but IT can't do it by themselves. They need the whole business behind them. And as an organization, if you are an organization leader, it's up to you to really make sure that you understand as an organization how this impacts processes across all of your teams. So as we're talking about some of these things, I'll point out where we have different teams that need to be involved and things that need to be addressed or considered as we go through. Part of that is breaking this out between technical, physical, and administrative. So starting with technical, this is actually, this role-based access and least privilege is a little bit, it's a little bit technical. It's actually a lot technical. It's a little bit administrative. It's a little bit physical, right? So this one kind of bridges all three areas. So role-based access and least privilege. This means that we only give people access to the information that they need in order to perform their job function. And we give them access based on their job function, not based on anything else. So the easiest example here is if your organization hires someone new and says, okay, this person is going to be doing A, B, and C. And Mike over here does similar things. So we'll just copy all of Mike's access over for this new hire, right? That's not role-based access. That is access, and it's access control, but it's not based on the role, it's based on Mike. Now, if Mike's been at the company for 10 years, and 3 years ago, Mike worked on a project where he had granted access to some special system that this new person shouldn't have access to, it's possible that this new person is going to get access to that special system, right? It's possible that Mike has things outside the scope of what we would typically expect based on the role. So we want to be really thoughtful about this. We want to be able to define what are our roles, what are the systems that they need access to, within those systems, what are the data points that they need access to, and we want to limit that as much as possible. Now, the goal here is not to prevent efficiency, right? It's like everybody's like, I hate security. It's so inefficient. It's frustrating, right? Yeah, there are going to be some things that are going to be a little bit more difficult, but the goal here is not to create inefficiency. The goal here is to reduce risk. The goal here is to be thoughtful about who has access to what information and why they need that, right? So I'll use Mainstay as an example. I'm the director of information security over here. I work on information security. I work with our clients. I work with my team. I don't manage all the other managers. I don't need access to any HR data other than my team's information, right? So if I had access to all of our salary information, that would be inappropriate. That's not applicable to my role, right? So I don't have access to those things. I don't manage our firewall. I don't manage our network. I don't have access to those things. I don't need access to those things. Based on my role, there are things that I have access to and things that I don't. So you need to think about who has access to what, where that access is managed, and how we're monitoring that. So there you go. Role-based access, least privilege, limit access, limit risk. Unique user and device authentication. So this is an important one because we want to be able to authenticate our users. We want to make sure that each of our users can be identified as an individual. So if you are an organization that uses a bunch of shared accounts, that's something to think about. The risk with shared accounts, and the reason that shared accounts aren't recommended from a compliance perspective, is because if a shared account is used to compromise data, you as an organization, from an incident response perspective, aren't going to have a whole lot to go on when it comes to trying to figure out what happened. So we want to be really careful about things like shared accounts. Now, they happen, absolutely. Manufacturing floors, people logging into CNC machines, right? There's absolutely situations where you have shared accounts. The question is, can we get away from using those shared accounts? And if not, how can we add additional layers of protection in order to continue to be able to identify who's doing what on the system? So a couple of things that I want to add there. I would like to introduce you to the concept of compensatory controls. These are some of my favorite things. There are situations in which you just need to have certain things in place, right? From a from an efficiency perspective, from an operational perspective, there are just some things that you need to have in place. If you cannot meet the compliance requirement directly, there are opportunities to implement what we call compensatory controls, meaning we're putting additional protections in place to further protect this situation because we know that we're, increasing risk or that we're not fully complying. So let me go back to my shared account example. If you have a CNC machine that is part of, your manufacturing floor, you have a shared account. People need to log into that shared account. There are opportunities for you to create additional security layers to say, okay, if we know that multiple people can log into this CNC account or the CNC machine, what additional protections can we put in place, right? What additional tools can we use? Well, one option is to put some cameras in the space. So if anybody ever accesses that machine without, if anything ever happens with that machine, if any data ever gets exfiltrated, you have the footage that you can go back to see who it actually was that logged in, right? Sometimes there's opportunities, depending on how your facility is configured, there are opportunities to limit those machines to particular areas. So you can put this in a locked area and have people badge in. There's some access control that you can put in place. So we know who badged into that room and then logged into that machine, right? So there are some additional compensatory controls that we could consider if we absolutely can't get away from using the shared account. So just some really basic examples, but think about how you can additionally protect your organization when you're not able to comply directly with the requirements. User and device authentication, we want to make sure that the username is, again, unique to the individual and that there are complex passwords in place. So complex, there's some debate in the world around complex. My recommendation is a minimum of 10 characters. That's just a recommendation, minimum of 10 characters. I know people are like, oh gosh, it's true. So long and strong passwords, the longer your passwords are, the less likely they are to get compromised. So Joey just asked a question. What if you just lock down the shared account to not access any CUI? It's great. Yeah. Yep. I think that's a great idea. If there's no access to CUI, then you can denote that and say, these are the accounts that have access to CUI. These are the places that we are storing CUI. These are the things that are outside of CUI. So Joey, I will add some additional context to that in just a second, but yes, that's absolutely a reasonable approach to prevent those accounts from gaining access to CUI. Okay, so we talked about user and device authentication. Spoiler alert, that's not the first time you're going to hear me say long and strong passwords, so sorry, be a little repetitive on that one. Network segmentation. So this includes a DMZ or a demilitarized zone for public-facing services. So what this means is that if you have any portion of your network that is accessible outside of your organization. So let's say that you have a customer database that you manage that has a customer portal where customers can upload schematics, for example. If you have that external facing portal, that portion of your network needs to be separated logically from everything else, so that if that externally facing portal gets compromised, it doesn't automatically mean that the rest of your network can also get compromised. So you want to create some logical separation. This is definitely something that you're going to need support from IT, but you want to make sure that any externally facing public services are in a DMZ. Now, again, if you are external, if you think about any publicly facing services and you're thinking just about your website and your website has no CUI and there's nothing on your website that allows people to upload information, there's no document share, there's no system access, none of that, then your website could potentially be sort of outside of your network boundary, outside of your security boundary, and wouldn't necessarily need to be in a DMZ at this point. That makes sense. Media sanitization. So this is one that is often missed. It's really important. What this means is that you need to make sure that any media that you're using that is storing data, again, specifically CUI or SCI, I'm sorry, we're in level 1, so just FCI. We are talking about media standardization. When we get to level 2, CUI will come into it. But any device that is storing, we'll go with sensitive information. How about that? You want to make sure that you are wiping that data. You're wiping those devices if those devices are going to be reused or are no longer needed. So for example, if you have a laptop that one of your engineers has been using, and that laptop then gets repurposed to be for your new HR manager, for example, you want to make sure that all of that engineering information, all of the data stored there, everything on that laptop is completely wiped, that system is set back to factory resets, and that when we give it to your HR manager, there's no risk of information being transferred from one employee to the other, right? So the engineer has access to a ton of CUI, your HR manager doesn't need access to that. So you want to be really careful about media sanitization. And that applies to laptops, desktops, servers, USB sticks, external hard drives, backup media, depending on what kind of backup media you're using. So you want to be really thoughtful about all the places that you are storing data. And then whenever you're done with those locations or whenever you're done with that data, that you're sanitizing that media fully. You want to have a centrally managed antivirus and anti-malware. So the key things here, we want to make sure that every device on the system has antivirus, anti-malware software on it. And the centrally managed piece comes in that we want to be able to have a central location for notifications. We want somebody to be monitoring that so that if something happens on the network, that we have visibility into it, that we're getting alerted proactively. The other piece that we want to make sure is in place here is that definitions, so virus definitions, are updated as they are released. So there are some antivirus softwares that update definitions on like a weekly basis. What you're looking for is an application that virus definitions are updated in real time so that you don't become the victim of an attack in that interim time period where you're waiting for things to be updated. So as soon as definitions are released, you want to make sure that your antivirus is updating according to those definitions. And then patch management. So we want to make sure that all of our machines, all of our systems, all of our applications are up to date. Every time an update is done, there's typically, some sort of changes that are being made. Some of them are mostly cosmetic, but there's a lot of, especially with operating systems, there's always some sort of security updates. There's, gaps that are being filled, vulnerabilities that are being addressed. So you want to make sure that you have a really comprehensive patch management process in place. So again, you may need to work with your IT on this, but you want to make sure that you have that process, that you document that process, and that you know and understand if you have systems that can't be upgraded or patched anymore. So if you have Windows 7 machines, can't be patched, can't be updated anymore, that's a risk to your organization. That is a challenge for compliance. Those machines you're going to want to consider replacing very, very quickly, or you're going to want to try to segment them, so going back to the DMZ. But that's kind of getting a little bit into the weeds. You just want to make sure that you know and understand what systems you have that can't be patched anymore because they create a significant amount of risk to your organization. Okay, so those are the technical pieces. Easy peasy, right? Physical. So physical access controls. So we want to make sure that we're limiting who has access to the building, who has access to our machines, who has access to our documentation, who has access to our server room. We want to make sure that we're limiting physical access, and that for those that do have this, physical access, we want to make sure that we understand what's happening while they're in the building. We want to make sure that they're monitored, that they're checking in, that we know who's in the building, and that we know what they have access to. So this is going to include separation of access to key areas, right? So your server room, if you have one, shouldn't be accessible by all of your staff. It should be only accessible by IT and maybe one or two key individuals within your organization. So that's something to consider as you move forward. And then visitor management, you just want to make sure that you know who's in the building. You want to make sure you know who they are, what they're doing there. You want to make sure that you are monitoring their behavior. If you have individuals who are given unfettered access, meaning that they're not escorted while they're in your facility, you want to make sure that you do a full vet process on them to understand whether or not they are a risk to your organization, whether or not they should have access to your facility. One of the things that is often missed here when we're thinking about physical access is building maintenance providers. If you have a building that you rent, if you are a management company, can send in painters, HVAC, cleaners, that type of thing. Or if you have a cleaning company that you've hired yourself and they have access, after hours, they have access to everything. You want to make sure that you're really thoughtful about that access and what they might have access to. And a lot of this ties back to not only digital access, but physical data. So if you have a lot of data, if you have a lot of files, if you have a lot of printed materials that could be considered sensitive, you want to make sure that you have a process in place to lock that up or prevent access to that for anyone who might have access to your facility. And then the last piece here is administrative. So this is where we start thinking about things like, how do we document this? How do we demonstrate what's happening? How do we communicate to our staff? How do we manage this starting ground here? How do we manage all of these things? How do we make sure that all these things are in place? So two key things that you need to have at this level is acceptable use guidelines. So this is basically just a policy or a guideline that says, these are the things that you can and can't do when you're on our network. These are the things that we expect from our employees. These are the things that are not acceptable. And we should ask our employees to review and sign off on that. We should ask them to commit that they will align with those acceptable use guidelines. And then a network boundary diagram. So this goes back to the question that Joey asked earlier, but one of the things that you have to think about when you are looking at your overall infrastructure is that you have a network boundary, which is basically your entire information system. So that could be as small as a single server with a couple of applications. It could be fully cloud if you are only using cloud applications. It could be multiple servers, hundreds of workstations, hundreds of different VLANs, different networks. I mean, it could be incredibly complex. So depending on the size of your network boundary, you want to think about, where do you actually store CUI? So your security boundary could be a subset of your network boundary. So let's say, for example, an organization has two different servers. They have two different businesses. They have a government business and they have a commercial business. Well, if there's no overlap between those two, one of the servers is for government, one of the servers is for commercial. Your network boundary includes all of those things, but your security boundary, your CUI boundary, could just be that government section, which means that all of the protections that we're talking about just need to apply to that government section. Now, it sounds great. Sounds like a good idea. What we find is that most organizations, when they start to try to create this differentiation, it's really, really difficult. Not a lot of organizations can successfully separate the two parts of their business. Typically, organizations aren't creating a whole separate process for government work compared to commercial work. So it's something to consider. It's an option, but it may or may not, in reality, it may or may not play out the way that you think it will. So level 1, questions? All right, here we go. Level 2. So we started with 17, now we're up to 110. Small jump, small jump. So here we have 17 different domains. So you'll see the 6 that we started with. We have added audit and accountability. We've added awareness and training, configuration management, incident response, maintenance, personnel security, recovery, risk management, security assessment, and that's it. So lots of domains here, lots of requirements. All the things that we covered in level 1 still apply here, in addition to all the rest of the 110. So I have broken this out over 2 slides because there was too much to jam into one slide. I didn't want to make it an eye chart for you all. Okay, so key components here. Again, we're going with the approach that these are things that on a broader level you need to have in place. These are things that are more likely to appear on your plan of action and milestones and have multiple individual controls and requirements that are associated with them. Okay, so the first thing from a technical perspective, you have to have multi-factor authentication. Now, this is addressed in multiple different practices. You have to have multi-factor authentication in a variety of different places. So you have to have multi-factor authentication for remote access. You need to have, so like your VPN, if you're connecting remotely to your network. You need to have multi-factor authentication for local network access. So when you come into the office and you sit down at your computer and you log in, you should have multi-factor authentication there. Anything that is being done from an administrative perspective, if you have a system administrator logging into your network to make changes to your firewall, multi-factor authentication should be required there. Now that could be on the firewall interface, that could be on your network interface. There's a couple of places that you could put that, but you need to have, for administrative tasks, you need to have that multi-factor authentication in place. So this piece has a variety of different implications. This piece could be implemented in a couple of different ways. So there's an opportunity to leverage like an app on your phone. There's an opportunity to leverage things like smart cards or YubiKeys, which are just sort of USB verification. Because they verificators, that's not a word. Verification of who you are as an individual. So multi-factor authentication, if you're not familiar, is a combination of something you know, which is typically your username and password, and then something you have, which is either a code that gets generated by an app on your phone, or a physical something like a smart card or a YubiKey. So you want to make sure that you have both of those things in place for a variety of different locations on your network. There is a SIM solution required. So a SIM solution is a security incident and event management solution. This is a requirement of CMMC Level 2, NIST 800-171, because the level of monitoring that these requirements demand are very difficult to implement if you don't have a SIM solution. So the expectation is that you are gathering all of your network logs, that you are pulling them into a central location, that those logs are being correlated and any anomalies are being identified and alerted on. So let me break that down a little bit. In your network infrastructure, pretty much everything you do creates some sort of a log. Every time I log into my computer, a log is created. Every time I log out of my computer, a log is created. If I download things, if I update things, if I change things, those are all logged. Across your network, all of these logs need to be collected. They need to be collected in a central location, according to the compliance requirements, and they need to be correlated, meaning that the logs need to be compared against each other to look for things that are weird or unexpected. So for example, if I log into my computer this morning at 8:30 in Manchester, New Hampshire, and then at 9:15, I log into my computer from Phoenix, Arizona, our SIM solution will identify like, hey, that's weird. That doesn't make sense. Those places are very far apart. And why is she logging in a second time? She's still logged in, right? Like there's no log out, there's no, right? It will identify that and it will alert that this is anomalous behavior. Real world example, we had a client who was logging into QuickBooks, and QuickBooks was having issues with one of their data centers. So they leveraged their geo redundancy, meaning that they were routing traffic through a German data center as opposed to their normal, whatever other data center they were using, whatever their normal was, that's not where the traffic was going. So it looked like, according to the logs, it looked like this individual was logging into QuickBooks from Germany, which she wasn't, she was in New Hampshire, but that's what it looked like. And the SIM solution gave us a notification and said, hey, are you sure this person should be logging in from Germany? We reached out to the organization and said, hey, what's going on? And they said, no, she's here, she's logged in, whatever. We did additional research and identified that QuickBooks was rerouting traffic. So those are the kinds of things that we find with a SIM solution. To try to do that without a SIM solution is very difficult. There's a lot of logs, there's a lot of information. So the recommendation here is that you have a SIM solution in place. Now, we haven't really talked much about the implementation cost or difficulty for any of these things, but I will tell you that from an implementation cost and management perspective, the SIM solution is going to be one of the more expensive items that you're going to have to review, implement, and pay for. So my recommendation is that you start thinking now about how you would implement that. It's not necessarily something that I would say do first. I think you're probably going to have to budget for it and work your way up to it. But it is important to note that this is one of the heavier lifts when it comes to implementing the technology requirements of CMMC. So just keep that in mind as you're processing all of this. So the next section is additional group policy, which is GPO, and network hardening. So level 2 requires that we have encryption in place for data at rest and in transit, meaning that data that is being stored on our network is encrypted while it's being stored and while it's being transferred around our network, as well as outside of our network, that information and that traffic is encrypted. DNS filtering, this is domain name services, DNS filtering, making sure that we are limiting access, that we are blocking certain sites, that we are blocking certain traffic, that we have that filtering in place. Mobile code management. So when you hear mobile code management, you probably think cell phones. Mobile code management is actually a little bit different. The way that mobile code management is defined with 800.171 CMMC is tied to things like Adobe or Java or ActiveX. Those are all considered mobile code. They are notoriously flawed, and they are new versions are released pretty regularly, so they are often out of date in terms of security features, and so there's typically a lot of flaws associated with those in your network. So trying to control the use of that mobile code, we've seen organizations that have like 20 different versions of Adobe on their network. Sometimes you have to keep old versions of Adobe because of the applications that you're using, or Java, for example. But understanding what mobile code you're using and how you're managing that is going to be really important. Wireless security is important, making sure that we have a minimum of WPA2 encryption protocols on your wireless network. That's an important piece. Ideally, you want to get to the point where you have 802.1x, which is just a higher level encryption protocol, but at a minimum, we're looking at WPA2. You should also have, just so you're thinking about it, you should also have a production and a guest wireless separated out. You shouldn't have guests ever connecting to your production wireless. And if you have individual users who are using cell phones at work, their cell phones should be forced to connect to the guest wireless as opposed to your production wireless. So just something to think about, separating those out. Okay, the no local admins, this is a big one. Somebody just started groaning. I can't hear it, but I know it. I know it's happening. So no local admins, what this means is essentially that individual users shouldn't be local admins on their systems. Now, this is one of those things where we have to try to find the balance between what makes sense for an organizational perspective and how do we secure the organization as effectively as possible. So again, I'm going to use Mainstay as an example, but we deal with this with all of our clients. I think every manufacturing organization that I have worked with has had some level of role or some set of individuals that need local admin access because of their function. I believe that, and I could be incorrect, but I believe that there are some versions of CAD, for example, that require you to be a local admin on your machine. So there are some challenges that we face here when it comes to the actual implementation of this, but anyone who is a local admin can override some of the security layers that we're putting in place. And so what that means is that if you have all of the right security layers in place, but then you give individuals local admin, you actually no longer have control of all of those things because they now have control. And so unless you can monitor that very closely, you run into a situation where you don't actually have full ability to control and monitor the environment. Typically what we see here is that we separate login access. So if you need local admin access, you get a standard user account and an administrator account. And then when you need to run things as an administrator, you can log in with those administrator credentials. But we want to make sure that wherever possible, you're preventing people from being local admins on their machines. For example, I'm not a local admin on my machine. I don't need to. Based on the work that I do, I can do everything that I need to do without that local administrator access. However, our network engineers absolutely have that admin access. So we have some separation, and we have some compensatory controls in place to manage that. FIPS firewall, IDS and IPS. So IDS is intrusion detection and IPS is intrusion prevention. Basically, for 800.171 CMMC, you are required to have FIPS validated encryption in place. And this means that on your firewall, you need to have a FIPS validated firewall, and it needs to be in FIPS validated mode. It needs to be configured for FIPS validation. We recommend intrusion detection and intrusion prevention, which gets you some additional controls and additional limitations in monitoring. Remember that SIM solution we talked about? We want to make sure that we have IDS and IPS that are monitoring behavior on the firewall so that it can alert us if anything anomalous is going on. We also require advanced email protections. Advanced email protections are things like sandboxing for attachments, scanning for attachments, making sure that we're evaluating links. So safe links is a really important piece. We want to make sure that we have those email protections in place. This is one that, a lot of these things are really good sort of real world risk things, but advanced email protections are really important from a real world risk perspective, because more than 90% of data compromise actually starts with a phishing email. So if you can control and manage access to email, limit clicking on unnecessary links, limit downloading of malicious documents, or potentially malicious documents, that will save your organization potentially some heartbreak from a real world risk perspective. Mobile device management. So this is, earlier we talked about mobile code. Mobile device management is actually talking about cell phones and tablets. So any device that is considered a mobile device, you want to make sure that you have mobile device management in place if individuals in your organization can access any sensitive information from their phones. So first question is, what can they access from their phones? If you have Office 365, for example, and people can log into their email on their phone, whether it's personal or work owned, you want to make sure that you are managing that access and that you're managing that data. Mobile device management as a tool actually containerizes corporate information from personal information. So I have one phone that I use that is my personal phone, but I can access my mainstay information on it. We have something called Microsoft Intune, which is a mobile device management solution. And basically what it does is it creates a digital container, and all of my mainstay information lives in that digital container. And I can't take information out of that container. So I can't go in and take client information and save it into my notes, because notes is not part of my container, but my OneDrive is, for example. And basically what that does is it keeps that information segmented. And then should I ever leave mainstay, it gives mainstay the opportunity to wipe everything that's in that container. It doesn't impact any of my personal stuff, but it does give you the ability to wipe everything in that container so you can be sure that that data doesn't go with people who leave your organization. So this is an important one. And as we get more and more reliant on mobile devices, as we get more and more reliant on applications, cloud apps that also have mobile apps, we want to make sure that we're protecting that information as much as possible. Configuration and change management. So this is really tied to understanding how systems are configured and understanding what changes are being made to the network, what changes are being made to devices in terms of how they impact security. So you want to have a baseline to say, every time we get a new firewall, this is the baseline set of requirements that we have. Every time we deploy a new laptop, this is the baseline set of requirements that we have, right? It has to be encrypted. It has to have local multi-factor authentication. It has to have patching updated, right? Like there's all these things that we set as our baseline. So creating that baseline and then managing any changes to that. So if we say, now for our laptops, we have a new baseline that in addition to those things that we're doing, we're also adding, some other level of, endpoint detection and response. We're adding that. So that's our new baseline. So we want to make sure that we're tracking that, and we're tracking any changes to the system and the network. If you have changes to your firewall rules, so for example, let's say that you are an organization that is an international organization, and you currently have Mexico, traffic to and from Mexico blocked on your firewall, but you acquire a subsidiary with a location in Mexico. So now you have to change how that communication goes, right? Because you have a subsidiary and you need to be able to communicate with them. You potentially need to change the firewall configuration. And as a result, you need to have a conversation about that. What is the risk to the organization? What does that mean in terms of your firewall configuration baseline? If you typically block Mexico, what does that mean going forward? What is the risk to the organization? I think I already said that. And then how do we mitigate any of that risk associated with this change, right? So we don't want individuals just going in and making the change. We want to make sure that we understand as an organization what the risk is of that change, and then how do we overcome that, or how do we address that? Application and communication whitelisting and blacklisting. So this is a big one. It's one line, but it's a big one. So we're talking about both applications, meaning that we're limiting what people can download, what types of applications they can download. And then communication, we're limiting what type of communication, and we need both inbound and outbound limitations here. So we need to monitor traffic in both directions. So this is a pretty heavy lift. And from a technical perspective, there's a couple of different tools that you might need. There's a couple of different approaches here. And there's a good amount of work in terms of determining what should be on a whitelist versus a blacklist. So a blacklist is basically a list of things that you can't access, right? It's a list of website categories that you are unable to access from your network. So we're blocking, gambling sites, adult content sites, those types of things. That's a blacklist, saying you can't access these things. A whitelist, on the other hand, is a list of things that you can access, which is typically much harder because trying to figure out all the potential websites or all the potential applications that people might use could be difficult. So a whitelist approach means that everything is blocked except for the things that we allow. So you have a couple of options there. There's a couple of different ways to configure that, but that is something that you should think about across the board for how you're managing that. You need to have an asset inventory, including removable media. So making sure that we understand what are our devices, who's accessing, or which devices are accessing the network. We're talking about laptops, desktops, servers, cell phones, USB, removable media, backup, appliances, tablets, all kinds of things, anything that might be connecting. You also want to include things like printers and IoT devices. So IoT is Internet of Things. So if you have smart thermostats, if you have wireless connected or internet connected printers or internet connected machines, these are all things that you should be considering when it comes to your asset inventory. And then backup solutions. So you should have a comprehensive backup solution in place. You should also test those backups periodically and make sure that they're encrypted wherever they live. From a real world risk perspective, we recommend that you also have an on-premise and offline copy of your backup, so that if in the unfortunate event that you get hit with ransomware, your backups aren't also impacted by that ransomware. You want to make sure that they're separate, offline, and accessible in the event that you have a critical outage. Okay, lots of technical information. Questions on any of that? Okay, just going to keep on trucking. All right, key components. So level 2, we have some additional protections around physical. So in this case, for level 2, we need to have facility logs. We need to have data protections. We need to have key management in place. So if you ask yourself the question, who has a physical key or an access fob, or both, to my building? Could I list everyone that has one of those and know whether or not that's the complete list of what's been given out? I don't know, but that's an important question to ask. If you believe that there are people who have access to your physical facility that you couldn't name off the top of your head, or if you have concerns that people who may have left the organization still have an active key or still have an access code to get into your facility, you should probably revisit your key and access controls for your physical environment. All right, administrative. So from an administrative perspective, the heavy lift comes in at level 2. So if you remember, in level 1, we had an acceptable use policy and a network diagram. For level 2, we need a full system security plan. So system security plan includes things like network diagrams, data classification, media labeling, policies like access control policies, incident response policies, all kinds of things. So typically your system security plan, and if you're an organization that's worked through this with Mainstay, you know, these are typically somewhere between 70 and 90 pages long. So it's a lot of information that you need to document. It's very detailed. It requires information on your data classification, your network infrastructure, your roles and responsibilities, your monitoring processes, your policies, employee sign-offs. There's a lot of things that go into a system security plan. But basically the sum total of this is that this documents how you're managing your overall security program and where all the information lives and who's responsible for what. So all of the things underneath this is the 2nd through 6th bullet. These are all things that are included in your system security plan. But these are things that aren't just included in your system security plan, right? So you have policies associated with these in your system security plan, but there are some additional things that you need to be thinking about when it comes to implementing these particular pieces. So risk and security assessments, you need to have both mitigation plans and oversight for risk and security assessments. The recommendation is to have a qualified third party do a risk and security assessment instead of doing that internally, get an outside perspective on that, making sure that the recommendations that you receive from your risk assessment process are assigned to individual owners, the tasks are assigned to individual owners, and that there's oversight and monitoring for the actual implementation of those things. Vulnerability management, so this includes things like external vulnerability scanning and having a process in place with your teams to bridge those gaps, to close those vulnerabilities, making sure that we understand what the vulnerability process is and how we're closing those gaps. This includes things like industry notifications. So if you don't already get notifications from CISA, you should sign up for their notifications. They have a lot of really important things that they send out. Looking at any flaws that you get, any information that you get from vendors. So recently you probably heard about Log4j, right? There's a whole lot of chaos around that. There was a lot of vulnerabilities created around that, and making sure that you are tracking on those things, that you're following those, and that anything that applies to your system, you're addressing. So questions, does penetration testing count for risk and security assessments? It's a good question. Yes and no. So it does, not completely. There are things that you need to assess in the risk and security assessment process that are not addressed in penetration testing. So penetration testing is typically very technical in nature and is really just about exploiting vulnerabilities and seeing how far the penetration tester can get into your network. A risk and security assessment also includes things like understanding business processes, understanding endpoint management, encryption, understanding data flows, understanding things like data destruction processes, that type of thing. So a risk and security assessment process is much bigger than just the penetration test. Although a penetration test covers a portion of it, so it's included in it, but not necessarily a requirement, right? It's not necessarily a full. So let me say that again. it's a portion of it, it covers a portion of it, but it's also not really a requirement. So there's nothing in CMMC Level 1 or Level 2 that says that you need to have a penetration test, but it will give you some information about your vulnerabilities. One thing that I would say, just based on what I know about the industry and personal experience, is that penetration tests are typically very, very expensive. They take a good number of hours, a very specialized resource, and as a result have a fairly high cost. I would recommend not trying to do a penetration test until you have a vulnerability management program in place. If you haven't done an external vulnerability scan and remediated any external vulnerabilities that you have found, if you haven't done an internal vulnerability scan and attempted to remediate as much of those as possible, it doesn't really make sense to do a penetration test, because the first thing that they're going to do, depending on the type of test you get, are those vulnerability scans. So vulnerability scans are also a lot less expensive and a lot easier to manage. So I would recommend having some vulnerability management in place before you go the pen test route. It should save you some time and a pretty decent chunk of money. Now, once you got to the point where you're mature enough in that vulnerability management program and you think you've remediated everything you can, then a pen test is a great opportunity for you to really test those defenses. But if you don't already have vulnerability management in place, I would start there. Business continuity and incident response. So making sure that we have processes in place for both business continuity and incident response. These are things that are absolutely organizationalized. So these are not just, hey, IT, do we have good backups, right? That's not at all what we're talking about here. It's part of it, but it's not the full gamut. So we want to make sure that we have comprehensive business continuity. So think about things like, if our building burns down, what can we still do? What do we have in the cloud? What can we access? What can we not access? Right? If we have no power, what can we access? What can we not access? If our system gets compromised and we have to shut down key servers, what does that mean for our business? What can we continue to do? What can't we continue to do? It also includes things like, how do we communicate to our customers and clients? How do we communicate to our staff? How do we communicate internally? How do we prioritize recovery? How do we react in those situations? Who does what? The first time you have a cybersecurity incident, you don't want that to be the first time that any of your leadership team has thought about what they would do in that situation, right? We don't want panic decisions when it comes to business continuity and incident response. So build out those programs, test it, do tabletop exercises, run through it, practice it, talk about it, make sure everybody's really clear on that. Continuous monitoring. You want to make sure that you have continuous monitoring of the entire program. So again, going back to some of the things that I have talked about, we want to make sure that continuous monitoring is continuous monitoring for the whole organization, not just IT. IT is a part of it, but continuous monitoring for the whole organization. We want to be managing access control. We want to be managing personnel security, which is the next bullet down. So things like onboarding and offboarding, background checks. We want to make sure that we're managing our individual users. We want to make sure that we're managing our business flow. We want to make sure that changes to our network infrastructure are being communicated and approved at a higher level. We want to make sure that we're monitoring risk to the overall organization, which includes people, process, and technology, right? So we want to look big picture. So continuous monitoring is really important as an organization, to understand what are the things that we should be monitoring, what are the things that we should be doing, who's responsible for that, how do we document it, where do we keep that documentation, et cetera. So we want to make sure we have all that in place. And then personnel security, we just want to make sure that we understand who we have. We want to make sure that we understand how we're onboarding them, what access we're granting them, when we're offboarding them, how are we eliminating that access, background checking, we want employee training, we want their awareness level of threats to the organization to be very high. We want to make sure that they understand that they have a crucial role in protecting your organization. So that's a lot, right? 110 requirements, a lot of things to think about. That's all. That's as in-depth as we're going to get. So the next piece we're going to go into is going to be the self-assessment process. So I'm going to pause there, see if there's any questions before we move on to the assessment process. All right, here we go. All right, so the self-assessment process. So a couple of key things that you want to think about in your self-assessment process. So the first is, what level of compliance do you think you need to align with? If you are very confident that you have no CUI, start with level 1, go from there, see what happens. If you think you might have CUI, or if you think you might be creating CUI, definitely head for level 2. It's a bigger undertaking, but you have to start somewhere, right? You have to start with a process somewhere. There are clearly documented self-assessment guides in the CMMC website, which we'll send you these presentations, and these are actually links directly to those assessment guides. So they're out there. Level 3 assessment guide, you'll remember, is still in progress, so no assessment guide yet. You have to enter your self-assessed score into this first database. Level 1, just enter your score and the expected date of full compliance. So the expected date of full compliance is basically when you think everything on your plan of action and milestones will be completed. So over in the green box on the right, we have a task of creating a plan of action and milestones. So the first thing that you need to do is go through the assessment process and understand what you have in place and what you don't. You have to create a plan of action and milestones that says, these are the things that we still need to do. One caveat to this that we're hearing from the DoD, which I haven't officially seen documented anywhere, but there's a lot of documentation out there. But what we're hearing in conversations and town halls is that anything with a score of 5 on the DCMA self-assessment document can't be on the plan of action and milestones. So this is going to be things like multi-factor authentication. They have rated that as a 5. It's crucial. So those are things that you can't have a plan of action and milestones for. You need to have those things implemented. The DCMA self-assessment document, this is where we were talking about earlier, getting your score for this first database. High is 110, low is -205. So making sure that you know and understand what those particular items are. And there's a link, I think, later in the presentation for the DCMA self-assessment documentation that shows you how everything is scored. If you have already had a gap analysis with Mainstay, it's included in your gap analysis document. It's in that spreadsheet for you. It's already accounted for. But that's going to be an important thing for you to note, because there are certain things that you can't put on that plan of action and milestones. For level 2, you need to enter your score, expected date of full compliance, and include an executive confirmation. So somebody other than the individual entering the score into SPURS, that is an executive at the company, has to document a confirmation of the validity of that score. So there's not an expectation that just one individual can review this, come up with a score, and enter it. It needs to have not only the score, but also the executive attestation to go with that. For the C3PAO assessment process, so OSCs, remember that's you, organization seeking certification, engage an RPO, registered practitioner, Mainstay or other, and or a C3PAO. So if you want to work with a registered practitioner, you don't have to, by the way, you could go this road on your own until you're ready for a C3PAO assessment. If you want to engage an RPO, we're all out in the marketplace on the CMMC AV website. And then you can also engage with a C3PAO to complete the actual assessment. Assessments will be completed by a certified assessor. They will gather information for each of these individual practices, 110. There are assessment guidelines. I think there are a total of 320 assessment guidelines associated with the 110 controls. So each control has a couple of assessment guidelines associated with it. So those 320 assessment requirements is what they're going to look for. And those are actually documented in the assessment guide, so you'll see those. There are 3 ways that an assessor is going to evaluate your organization. They're either going to interview staff, they're going to examine documentation, reports, data, etc., or they're going to test, meaning that demonstrations. A great example here is, we're going to interview somebody and say, how often do you have to, put in multi-factor authentication, or do you have to use multi-factor authentication when you log in remotely? The interviewee says, yes, we have to put in multi-factor authentication. And then the assessor will say, can you please log in remotely and demonstrate for me that 2FA is prompted and required. The expectation as it stands right now is that there will be a minimum of 2 pieces of evidence required per practice, and 2 of the 3 evidentiary categories above must be represented. So this will be across the assessment guidelines, the assessment objectives. So more to come on that. I put that in green because it's not real. Nobody's actually been assessed yet. So I'm not entirely sure what that's going to look like. I think that there's a little bit of flexibility with the assessor, but in general, that's what we're hearing for you to expect. So the moral of the story is don't just think that for things like, multi-factor, for example, that you can just say, yes, we have it. You need to be prepared to demonstrate it through evidence. For areas of remediation provided by the CA, which is the certified assessor, or items included on the POAM, the OSC will have 180 days to remediate those areas, and then a reassessment will be completed. So if the certified assessor identifies areas that they don't believe that you're compliant, and they are things that can be remediated, you will have 180 days after the initial assessment to do that, and then the CA will come back and reassess those particular items. Once the assessment work is finalized, the C3PAO will then make a recommendation to the accreditation body. The accreditation body will review the work and then actually award the certification if they agree with the C3PAO's assessment. So the certification will actually come from the AB, not the C3PAO, but the C3PAO will do the work and make the recommendation to the AB. Okay. CMMC AB website has all of this information on it, so you're welcome to go there and peruse at your leisure. Okay, what the heck do we do next? Where do we go from here? So things to consider. So evaluate where you are today. Ask yourself the hard questions. Ask yourself all the questions. Be really frank with yourself. Be really clear on where you stand. Be, grade on a curve, right? Or don't grade on a curve. Make sure you're being really, really specific. Think about these questions. Do you know what data you have? Do you know where it lives? Do you know who has access to it? Do you know how it flows through your organization? What do you have for technical infrastructure? Do you know whether or not patching is automatically happening? Do you know whether or not you have antivirus or anti-malware comprehensively at the organization? Is there a FIPS validated firewall in place? What do you have for log monitoring and auditing? What about policies? What policies do you have in place? Are people actually following those policies? Are those policies updated? If you have to dust off your policy binder, it's probably time to update those. If you don't know where they are in your file structure, you probably need to update your policies, making sure that everyone understands what the policies are and that training is happening. How are you doing on information security training? Do you have information security training? How is the awareness level of your organization? If we went to any one of your end users and said, tell me what you all do as an organization to protect data, would they have an answer? Would they not have an answer? Would some of them have an answer and others not? We need to understand sort of what that landscape looks like. What about physical security? If I were to show up at your physical security or your physical location, what could I have access to? Could I sign in and then wander around the building by myself? Would I be escorted the full time? If I walked by somebody's desk that had a whole bunch of schematics on it and I snagged one of them and put it in my purse, because I carry a big bag. If I just grabbed some of that, would anybody ever know? What would happen? What are the things that we should worry about from a physical perspective? Vendor management, this is a really important one. Who else are you giving access to? Who are you sharing data with? Who has access to your employee information? Who has access to your client information? Where are you storing that information? And how are you making sure that they're protecting it to the same level of expectation that you have for your protection? And then continuous monitoring. How are we tying it all together? If somebody came to you and said, tell me about your security program, tell me what's happening, tell me how it's working, tell me when the last time you assessed it was, would you have that in place? Maybe you have parts of it, maybe you don't have any of it, but these are the kinds of things that we should be asking ourselves and starting. Now, some of this might feel very overwhelming. right? But you have to start somewhere, and you can't figure out where you're going until you know where you are. So step one here is to complete an 800-171 assessment, or find someone that can do this for you. Mainstay is one of them. There are other companies out there that can assess you against 800-171. We highly recommend getting help if this isn't in an area that you're very comfortable with. We've talked about a lot of things today. There's a lot to consider from an information security perspective. There's a lot to consider from a compliance perspective. Most organizations don't do their own taxes because it's incredibly complex. CMMC 800-171, it's very similar. If you aren't fully versed in this area, get some help. There are organizations out there. We can help you. We can support you. This is what we do for a living. I talk 800-171 every single day. There's never a day that I don't talk about 800-171 or CMMC that I'm not on some sort of, webinar, that I'm not listening to a town hall, that I'm not, reading up on new documentation, et cetera. So find somebody who is an expert in this and let them help you. Create a plan of action and milestones. Be kind to yourself and plan ahead. If you don't have any of this, right? If you're just starting this journey, that's totally okay, but be very realistic about how you're going to get from point A to point B. Typically, these implementations, based on what we're seeing with our clients, you're talking about 18 to 24 months. This is a long process. There are a lot of things to consider. There's budgeting considerations, there's culture changes, there's infrastructure changes, there's training, there's all kinds of things that we need to get in place. And so you want to be really thoughtful about that. You want to be really reasonable about that. You want to make sure that you give yourself time to make good decisions, informed decisions, and then support those decisions in the best way possible. If you haven't already entered a SPUR score and you have done an assessment, make sure you get that into SPURs. Your contracting officer will ask you for it if they haven't already. So just get to the point where you have that. It's literally just a number. It's a calculation. It's a number, and then you put in the end date of your POAM. Okay. So for anyone interested, these are some ways that Mainstay can help you. We do gap analysis, as Eric mentioned. We've worked with NHMEP for years now, and all the way back to 800-171 the first time. We've been working with clients to do gap analyses, plans of action, milestones. We'll help you build those out. We'll continue to do policy work with you. There's a variety of things that we can help you with. If you want to continue down the path, we can do program implementation, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that we can help you with. So if you have questions, if you want to talk further, please, don't hesitate to reach out. But it's a lot to take in. I know you guys are probably all very overwhelmed at this moment and a lot to absorb. But certainly reach out to us, ask questions. We're here to help however we can. So we've sort of had questions and answers throughout, but if you have any additional questions, please send them over. And I think I'm gonna shoot it back to Eric.
Okay. Hey, Paige, thank you very much. And everybody, I apologize again. They're never going to let me be in charge anymore. I just found that out. No, I'm just teasing. But anyhow, yeah, again, thank you for coming back. And maybe we should have taken a break at that point anyway, and that might have looked more seamless. But regardless, again, thank you. So yeah, that concludes today's webinar, CMMC 2.0, what it means for DoD manufacturers. We will email you the slide presentation as well as the recording, and we did record both pieces. I believe Corey from Mainstay is going to try to put those together in one link, but it may be two separate links. I'm not really sure. Either way, we'll get that to you. Your feedback's very important to us. So in the reminders I sent you, and I'll send it again anyway, please complete the evaluation via the link in the email, and do that fairly soon. So so I don't have to keep bugging you about it. And as Paige mentioned, yes, we contract with Mainstay Technologies to work with our clients on CMMC now 2.0 compliance. I plan on following up with all you next week. But if you're interested in moving ahead before I reach you, give me a call, 603-724-0802. It's on the screen, as well as my email, Eric B, ERICB, at NHMEP.org. And that's really about it. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in the webinar. Thank you, Paige, and everybody have a good day.
Thanks, Eric. I'm gonna hang out
Take
for just
care.
a second, make sure there's no questions.
Yeah, and if they want to take down our information.
Yep, yep, we'll give people just a second.
Oh, there's a chat. What does that say? Thank you. Thank you too, Janelle.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Take care.
Excellent, thanks, have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.